Hey guys, it's Trevor here with Reading Time with Parker and Trevor. Today we're going to be reading again Hatchet with Gary Paulson. We're on chapter 14 this time. So last chapter on 13, Parker talked about how Brian has been trying to shoot fish with a bow and arrow, which don't make a whole lot of sense, but I think he'll learn. And I think we even figured out that Brian has been seeing some wolves in the forest. So interesting stuff. Let's get started on chapter 14 and see what happens. Mistakes. Small mistakes could turn into disasters. Funny little mistakes could snowball so that while you were still smiling at the humor, you could find yourself looking at death. In the city, if he had made a mistake, usually there was a way to rectify it, make it all right. If he fell on his bike and sprained a leg, he could wait for it to heal. If he forgot something at the store, he could find another food in the refrigerator. Now, it was different. Also quick. Also incredibly quick. If he sprained a leg here, he might starve before he could get around again. If he missed while he was hunting, or if a fish moved away, he might starve. If he got sick, really sick, he couldn't move. He might starve. Mistakes. Early in the new time, he had learned the most important thing, the truly vital knowledge that drives all creatures in the forest. Food is all. Food was simply everything. All things in the woods, from insects to fish to bears, were always looking for food. It was the great single driving influence of nature, to eat, all must eat. But the way he learned it almost killed him. His second new night, stomach full of fish and the fire smoldering in the shelter, he had been sound asleep when something he thought later it might be smell. He had awakened him. Near the fire, completely unafraid of smoking coals, completely unafraid of Brian, a skunk was digging where he had buried the eggs, where some silver of a moon in the faint pearl light. He could see the bushy tail, the white stripes down the back, and he had nearly smiled. He did not know how the skunk had found the eggs. Some smell, perhaps. Some tiny fragment of shell had left a smell, but it almost was cute. Its little head and little tail was dug, kicking the sand back. But those were his eggs, not the skunk's, and the half smile had been replaced with the fear that he might lose his food, and he grabbed a handful of sand and threw it at the skunk. Get out of here, he was going to say some silly human words, but in less than half a second the skunk had snapped its rear end up, curved the tail over, and sprayed Brian with a direct shot aimed at his head from less than 4 feet away. In the tiny confines of the shelter, the effort was devastating. The thick, sulphurous, rotten odor filled the small room, heavy, ugly, and stinking. The corrosive spray had hit his face, seared into his lungs and eyes, blinding him. He screamed and threw himself sideways, taking the entire wall off the shelter, and screamed and clawed out of the shelter and ran to the shore of the lake. Stumbling and tripping, he scrambled into the water and slammed his head back and forth, trying to wash his eyes, slashing at the water to clear his eyes. 100 funny cartoons he had seen about skunks, cute cartoons about the smell of skunks, cartoons to laugh at and joke about, but when the spray... Keep going. That paragraph. Why? 100 funny cartoons he had seen about skunks, cute cartoons about the smell of skunks, cartoons to laugh at and joke about. But when the spray hit, there was nothing funny about it. He was completely blind for almost 2 hours. A lifetime, he thought, that might be permanently blind, or at least impaired, and would have been the end. As it was, the pain in his eyes lasted for 2 days, bothered him after that for 2 weeks. The smell in the shelter, in his clothes, and in his hair was still there now, almost a month and a half later. And he had nearly smiled. Mistakes. Food had been protected. While he was in the lake trying to clear his eyes, the skunk went ahead and dug the rest of the turtle eggs and ate every last one of them. Licked all the shells clean and couldn't have cared less about Brian was thrashing around in the water like a dying carp. The skunk had found food and was taking it, and Brian was paying for a lesson. Protect food and have a good shelter, not just a shelter to keep the wind and rain out, but a shelter to protect, a shelter to make him safe. The day after the skunk, he set about making a good place to live. The basic idea had been good. The place for his shelter was right, but he just hadn't gone far enough. He'd been lazy, but now he knew the second most important thing about nature, what drives nature. Food was first, but the work for the food went on and on. Nothing in the nature was lazy. He had tried to take a shortcut and paid for it with the turtle eggs when he had come to like more than chicken eggs from the store. They had been fuller somehow and more depth to them. He set about improving the shelter by tearing it down from dead pines up the hill and brought down heavier logs and fastened several of them across the opening, wedging them at the top and burying the bottoms in the sand. Then he wove long branches in through them to make a truly tight wall, and still not satisfied, he took even thinner branches and wove those in the first weave. When he was at the last finish, he could not find a place to put his fist through. It all held together like a very stiff woven basket. He judged the door opening to be the weakest spot, and he took special time to weave a door of willows in so tight a mesh that no matter how a skunk tried or a porcupine, he thought, looking at the marks in his leg, it could not possibly get through. He had no hinges, but arranging some cut off limbs at the top. In the right way, he had a method of hook the door in place, and when he was in and the door was hung, he felt relatively safe. A bear, something big, could still get in by tearing at it, but nothing small could bother him, and the weave of the structure still allowed the smoke to filter up through the top and out. All in all, it took him 3 days to make the shelter, stopping to shoot fish and eat as he went, bathing 4 times a day to try to get the smell from the skunk to leave. When his house was finally done right, he turned to the constant problem, food. It was all right to hunt and eat, or fish and eat, but what happened if he had to go along without the food, a long time without it? What happened when the berries were gone and he got sick or hurt or thinking the skunk laid up temporarily? He needed a way to store food, a place to store it, and he needed food to store. Mistakes. He tried to learn from the mistakes. He couldn't bury food again, couldn't leave it in the shelter because something like a bear could get at it right away. It had to be high, somehow high and safe. Above the door to the shelter, up the rock face about 10 feet, was a small ledge that could make a natural storage place unreachable to animals, except that it was unreachable to him as well. A ladder, of course, he needed a ladder, but he had no way to fashion one, nothing to hold the steps on, and that stopped until he found a dead pine with many small branches still sticking out. Using this hatchet, he chopped the branches off so they stuck out 4 or 5 inches all up along the log. Then he cut the log off about 10 feet long and dragged it down to his shelter. It was a little heavy but dry, and he could manage it. And when he propped it up, he found he could climb to the ledge with ease, though the tree did roll from side to side a bit as he climbed. His food shelf, as he thought of it, had been fully covered with bird manure, and he carefully scraped it clean with sticks. He had never seen birds there, but they were probably because the smoke from the fire went up right across the opening that they didn't like the smoke. Still, he had learned, and he took time to weave a snug door from the small opening with the green willows, cutting it so it jammed in tightly. And when he finished he stood back and looked at the rock face, his shelter below, the food shelf above, and allowed a small bit of pride to come. Not bad, he thought. Not bad for somebody who used to have trouble greasing the bearings on his little bicycle. Not bad at all. Mistakes. He had made a good shelter and food shelf, but he had no food except for fish and the last of the berries. And the fish, as good as they still tasted then, were not something he could store. His mother had left some salmon out by mistake one time, and they went on an overnight trip to Cape Hasper to visit relatives. And when they got back to the filled the whole house. There was no way to store fish. At least he thought no way to store them dead, but as he looked at the weave of the structure, a thought came to him and he moved down to water. He had been putting the waste from the fish back in the water, and the food had attracted hundreds of new ones. I wondered, they seemed to come easily to the food, at least the small ones. He had no trouble shooting them, and even speared one with his old fish spear now that he knew to aim low. He could dangle something in his finger, and then they came right up to it. It might be possible, he thought. It might just be possible to trap them next some kind of pond. To his right, at the base of the rock bluff, there were piles of smaller rocks that had fallen from the main chunk splitters and hunks, from double fist size to some as large as his head. He spent an afternoon carrying rocks to the beach and making what amounted to a large pen for holding a live fish. 2 rock arms that stuck out 15 feet into the lake and curved around together at the end. Excuse me. Where the arms came together, he left an opening about 2 feet across. Then he sat on the shore and waited. When he had first started dropping the rocks, all the fish had darted away. But this fish trash pile of bones and skin and guts was in the pond area, and the prospect of food brought them back. Soon, under an hour, there were 30 or 40 small fish in the enclosure, and Brian made a gate by weaving small willows together into a fine mesh and closed them. Fresh fish, he had yelled. I have fresh fish for sale. Storing live fish to eat later had been a major breakthrough, he thought. It wasn't just keeping him from starving, it was trying to save ahead, thinking ahead. Of course, he didn't know then how sick he would get of fish. So, that was chapter 14. We learned that Brian had an encounter with a skunk in his shelter, and he got sprayed, and that the skunk eventually ate all of his turtle eggs that he had been eating. So that put it into his mind that he needed to redo his shelter because he's already got attacked with a porcupine, the skunk, and he's worried another attack. So he builds a new shelter that's very sturdy and good for what he can do. And then he eventually thinks of an idea to store fresh fish. So he makes a little enclosure in the lake to make a little pond of fresh fish. So as we can tell throughout the book, Brian is getting way better at adapting to his surrounding and learning the ways of survival. So we'll see what happens in chapter 15. Interesting stuff, but thanks for listening, guys.